The question is the budget papers and appropriation bills 2025 be noted. The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, here we are again. Take two, in fact, second time we've contemplated a state budget this year. And actually what I can do right at the outset of my contribution is indicate how proud I am of this chamber, actually, and how edifying it's been to listen to budget reply speeches across yesterday and today. Particularly may I pay respect to my independent colleagues in this chamber who have made excellent contributions on this budget, insightful, informed, passionate, clearly demonstrating their care for their community and their genuine desire to be electoral representatives of them in this place, this important House of Review. And I say that noting that there's still contributions yet to come from other members that I'm not able to reflect on yet, but I'm sure will be excellent. It's really fantastic to see how engaged and forensic members have been in their reflections on this budget, and I appreciate the effort that's gone into that. Particularly, I'm noting here Member for Murchison, who's just spoken on the budget, but also from yesterday, Member for Elwick, Member for Montgomery and the Member for Huon, who all provided very comprehensive contributions and really dug in to the detail of what we're looking at here. And it's not pretty, Madam Deputy President. It's not pretty at all. So, we all know the whys and the wherefores of how we find ourselves in this position, considering the second budget delivered for the 25-26 financial year. This second iteration differentiated from its May counterpart by the designation of interim, in inverted commas. However, it's worthwhile to briefly place the current state budget within the context of the analysis of and the concerns about that May version that was given as a pivotal catalyst, resulting then in that snap July election. A key criticism of the May budget was its refusal, or just gross failure, to take on board and act on the S-Lake Independent Review of Tasmania's State Finances, which was released in August 2024. A good 8 months between the release of that independent S-Lake report and the development of the state budget, or the presentation of the May state budget, one would think would provide sufficient time to consider the recommendations of that independent review of our financial system and respond accordingly with a fit-for-purpose fiscal reform plan as outlined in the next state budget. One would have thought, actually, that it indeed provided the political cover to bring forward a genuine proposal for reform back in that May budget. If there was a moment that a pivot could have happened to actual action from this government on fiscal reform, that was it, Madam Deputy President, and we didn't see hide nor hair of it. We know that it was certainly not the case that that's what was presented in the May budget, despite the clear articulation in the 2024 S-Lake Independent Review that, and I'm going to quote from that review, Tasmania's general government finances have deteriorated sharply over the past 6 years and will do so further over the next 3 years, end of quote. And the range of recommendations required to address revenue and expenditure challenges to shift the state towards fiscal sustainability. These were largely ignored by the former Treasurer in that earlier May budget. Further, the May budget tried to blithely blame everyone else, from the federal government to previous state governments, long in the past, Madam Deputy President, which were in existence well over a decade ago, of course, but also try to blame the public sector, the bogeyman of the public sector for this government. And by doing so, by throwing that blame around at all and sundry, that earlier budget attempt was roundly criticised for kicking the development of coherent fiscal reforms can down the road. Madam Deputy President, the reason why it's informative to briefly remind ourselves why it is we're dealing with an interim budget, I say in inverted commas, in November, the second for the financial year, is to test and evaluate to what extent were those key lessons learned by the government from the disastrous May budget to the current interim one now before us. And I think, Madam Deputy President, the answer is resoundingly clear in terms of lessons learned. Very little is the answer. Very few lessons learned. Despite the interim budget presenting and I quote, a marginally less dire picture of Tasmania's public finances, which was the summary from economist Saul Estlake, the current budget papers and the current Treasurer's speech on this budget reveal that unfortunately very little of long-term strategic substance was in fact learned. Mr President, one change though was evident, and that's that the effort made to try and sugarcoat the reality is persisting. This interim 2025-26 budget has been described in some quarters as a work of fiction, and I would have to agree. The Treasurer's formal budget speech and the interim budget papers presented a fantastical presentation of sets of numbers which do not add up, and a range of ideologically driven policy approaches which threaten to entrench the fact those numbers will keep failing to add up far into the future. Not only did the Treasurer present a work of fiction, it is, I would say, a dark fantasy of some kind, Mr President. Tim Burton-esque, perhaps, we might say. Exaggeration, distortion and clearly disconnected from reality. The reality of the average Tasmanian, at least, I would say. We were told of realistic optimism and success of the past decade. Absolute fantasy, Mr President. Further, Tasmanians were told of their bright future amidst the promises of a self-sustaining budget, Mr President. Sadly, I think what we'll find is many Tasmanians are struggling to find secure housing, to keep their heads above the increasing costs of living that they may well have a different definition of realistic optimism or a sense of when their future may be bright. Certainly the approximately 2,800 public sector employees facing unemployment in coming years may not be sharing such a bright vision of optimism for their future. Another example of that glossing over, or gaslighting, maybe another term, Mr President, is the reliance upon Tasmania's apparently lowest unemployment rate of any state as an indicator of a growing and strong economy. However, what isn't said is the fact that a much smaller proportion of Tasmania's population is in work or actively looking for it compared to the rest of the nation. Tasmania is at 61.4% as of September compared to the national figure of 67%. That's just one example, Mr President, of selective use of data that this government uses to manipulate a narrative. Selective use of data is a speciality of this Rockcliffe Liberal government. You only have to look at the much trumpeted 10,000 new homes by 2032 to see another example. That rubbery number of new homes, in inverted commas, is going to include blocks of land, crisis accommodation beds, which are absolutely needed but by no means a secure long-term affordable home, houses taken out of the existing private rental or property market, which are not new additional supply, just repurposed, etc., etc. That 10,000 new homes is a flashy headline grab for media and social media, but in reality, it's nothing but manipulation and spin. There are many more examples like this, Mr President, but I move on. Mr President, others, such as Mr Saul Estlake, as I mentioned before, outside this place, and here in this place, as I said, including in these budget replies from members for Elwick, Hugh and Montgomery and Murchison, and Mersey, I should have said. Didn't mean to miss you out, member for Mersey earlier. I just neglected to look at my list properly. And the member for Mersey have already placed granular critiques of this budget on the public record, and I'm not going to be delving into the numbers in as much detail as those members in my contribution. However, I will point to the glaring common failure shared in both the May and the current interim budget, and that's their failure to even attempt to grapple with the financial structural challenges of our state faces, or provide a holistic plan to get from the current situation to a position of actual fiscal sustainability. Bizarrely, the Treasurer has tried to describe this budget as a glide path to surplus and a balanced budget. Mr President, that's nothing less than deliberate obfuscation, an attempt to disguise the utter lack of any real plan for equitable budget repair. In fact, the Treasurer on ABC Mornings Radio last Friday, the day after the budget was brought down, said this, and I quote, "And so with budget repair, and that's their language, I would say budget improvement," end of quote. That's a farcical degree of denial right there, Mr President. In fact, these interim budget papers present a doubling down, as it were, a more deliberate and perverse kicking of that budget repair can down the road. Mr President, in a Mercury newspaper editorial, it was put very pithily in Saturday's paper where it stated, and I quote, The old saying goes that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, the second best time is now. So too with budget repair. And then further, Mr President, the nature of the problem should be well understood. The mounting debt problem facing the state budget was laid out in Treasury's Fiscal Sustainability Report as far back as 2021. It was elegantly restated in Saul Estlake's independent review of Tasmania's state finances in 2024, and yet the government seems determined to put off decisive action for as long as possible. Having ruled out tax increases and asset sales, spending cuts are the preferred method of balancing the books, with increasing numbers of public sector job cuts on the cards. End of quote. Mr President, that paints a picture a little more realistic and a little starker than the Treasurer's preferred terminology of budget improvement. But language semantics aside, the critical issue of and the urgent need for meaningful structural fiscal reform of the state's finances is widely recognised outside the executive government. Mr President, it has been for a long, long time, and no Treasurer abets, it didn't just start with COVID, as other members have rightly pointed out. This state and the nation received much earlier warning bells, for example, in the form of the global financial crisis, the GFC, back in 2009. And there have been other instances prior to that which threw into sharp relief our vulnerability to external global financial pressures and limited domestic capacity to mitigate those impacts. At the core of the growing calls for real structural reform is recognition for the need for greater and more equitable resilience to be hard-baked into those areas of our financial system which the state can control or mitigate. During the COVID period, I and many other voices from the community sector warned that so-called corrective budgetary measures risked calcifying current social and economic inequities, that we risked entrenching the growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots, those with hope and those without, Mr President. There were calls back then, as far back as 2021, as the Mercury editorial stated, to seize the opportunity and seriously assess and restructure how to disrupt intergenerational inequities and consciously rebuild our financial structures upon socially, economically equitable and sustainable foundations. Because we were concerned then, and as we remain concerned now, that debt-ridden budgets become the stalking horse to justify politically ideologically driven agendas under the guise of responsible, in inverted commas, financial reforms, particularly budgets with such disparity between revenue capacity and spending levels. Mr President, instead of meaningful discussion about real reform, what have we seen since the COVID shock of 2020? Well, let's have a look. We saw an early 2021 state election with more pork barrelling than you could poke a stick at, Mr President. And then again, with the early 2024 state election, another festival of splurging from the Liberals as they blithely racked up massive debt in election commitments again. As others have noted, 3/4 of the debt that we've added over the past decade has been the result of reckless election promises made by the Liberal government. Let's be clear, Mr President, on what that means. This Liberal government have been prepared to max out our state credit card to the detriment of generations to come to buy electoral outcomes for themselves, to keep their grip on power. And that's shameful, utterly shameful, Mr President. And in that same shameful vein, Mr President, we're now seeing positioning in this interim budget setting up public sector workers as the fiscal fall guy for this government's political self-interest. Let's be clear. Nobody argues there is not scope for ongoing improvement and modernising in our public service. Absolutely there is. However, when the only flagged cost-saving measures of consequence is to cut spending in one area, such as the public sector and those public services provided, rather than, oh, I don't know, maybe a proposed white elephant on the horizon, Mr President, we know that the estimated costs have already blown out catastrophically for that white elephant before even a hypothetical sod is turned on it. That's an ideologically driven choice, Mr President. So how should we avoid the ideologically driven budget improvements over evidence-based objective budget repair measures, Mr President? Well, Mr President, I want to talk for a moment about budget repair measures to reiterate some of the ideas and proposals that have been previously discussed in this place by me and others and deserve to be reiterated. Maybe if we keep putting it out there, at some stage the government's going to be desperate enough to pick them up, or we might have a change of government with a more receptive ear to some of these opportunities. Some members would recall that I previously proposed that the state establish an independent expert panel to undertake review of our financial system, particularly including the current and potential revenue streams, and how we develop an equitable path to a sustainable future by addressing our revenue issues. Equitable is the key term in this context, one that I'm not hearing much in the context of the interim budget, that's for sure. The cost and brunt of getting from here to there under this budget and the projections of the next budget are not going to be shared equitably or fairly. So for the benefit of new members, I believe it's worthwhile to reiterate my previous call for example, an independent expert fiscal reform panel, the purpose of which would be to take the political self-interest and ideological blockages out of the equation to the greatest extent possible. I also think it's pertinent within the context of recent debates in this place of how to improve parliamentary oversight of the executive's budgetary decisions and implementation.
Budget oversight.
Yeah, it didn't do the same thing, and I'm not going to get into that debate here because it's an entirely different vehicle that I'm suggesting, and I'll address some of that in my contribution. I reiterate my call again here, Mr. President, that in the context of the economic challenges faced by our state, the growing inequality that's holding our communities back and the stark realities of cuts that this and future budgets bode, we urgently need meaningful and effective structural reform of Tasmania's taxation and revenue system. This work becomes more imperative every year. Even with the inequitable Mr. President. Enough with the inequitable tinkering. The state deserves comprehensive, strategic review and reform. We know this. People will rightly point out Parliament has tried this previously, and some members here will recall and in fact participated in a tax review panel established back in 2010 under the power sharing Parliament that was in place at that time. That panel consisted of the then Labor Treasurer Lara Giddings MP, Liberal Opposition Treasury spokesperson Peter Gutwin MP, the Greens Treasury spokesperson Tim Morris MP, and as an independent representing the Upper House, the Honourable Member for Murchison, Ms Forrest. Some might be thinking this sounds a bit like the spurious multi-party panel the Treasurer has convened in the Lower House to inform the next budget, Mr President. But a key distinction was the 2010 panel's terms of reference were public. They invited public submissions and hearings were also held publicly. However, it couldn't avoid the inevitable, unfortunately, self-interest of its political party membership, with both Labor and Liberal representatives withdrawing from the panel as soon as it was time to make hard decisions. An experience, I think, Mr President, which reinforces the need for such fiscal reform entities to be truly independent of, but also accountable to, the Parliament. An independently appointed expert panel to undertake a fiscal review of the state's current taxation and revenue base and mechanisms to address the structural deficit, including how to diversify a progressive taxation and revenue base. Purposeful, transformative taxation review of the state's recognised narrow taxation and revenue base should seek potential modern, equitable and efficient means to broaden that base. It should test whether the current mix and emphasis of the state tax and revenue base provides the stability and certainty necessary to deliver important community services. And crucially, it could test whether there are any current revenue foregone options presented within our current state tax and revenue mix. And finally, it could identify any required transitional timeframes and support, including funding to assist those most affected by any proposed reforms. Obviously, Mr President, and sadly, any suggestion of taxation reform presents considerable political risk to the government or the opposition proposing it. We do need to take the political sting out of it somehow. Hence, I can only ever see this necessary work occurring via an independent panel of experts or another mechanism to achieve similar ends, which would not be constrained by political ideology and should be able to provide rigorous and credible options brought back to this Parliament for open debate. In fact, it would then be on the shoulders of this Parliament, and this Parliament in its makeup, with a minority in the lower house in the other place and a largely independent membership of the upper house, should be well placed to be able to advocate for and put appropriate pressure on the executive to begin to adopt measures brought to us by a panel that was independent and was providing advice and recommendations. The proposed expert panel on this kind of fiscal reform should be open and accountable too. It should invite stakeholder and community submissions, and it would report to this Parliament, not to the government of the day. As such, it could then inform parliamentary input and oversight of the government's implementation of any recommendations made by the expert panel, or in fact, Parliament exerting its power and using the mechanisms available to it to push the government towards the implementation of those recommendations. We already have a similar model in play with the Commission of Inquiry report and recommendations, which we received and tabled in this Parliament, and we then established a joint sessional committee tasked with examining the implementation of the recommendations that came from that separate independent Commission of Inquiry via their report. Mr President, I mentioned foregone potential revenue sources as needing review, and this is a weakness in this interim budget for sure. In fact, the bipartisan aversion to tackling this component of fiscal responsibility in a constructive manner is a broader weakness beyond just one particular budget or government. However, in the context of this particular interim budget, it's important to not just brush off the set of figures comprising the state's revenue base. As the Treasurer's speech details, the total revenue for the general government sector is estimated to be $9.5 billion. And as we are all aware, the majority of that $9.5 billion state income, 2/3 in fact, is derived from federal grants. The Treasurer goes to considerable pains to emphasise how our largest revenue source, the GST, is, and I quote, highly sensitive to national consumer spending, population share and GST relativities determined by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. Hence, Mr President, we have the periodic posturing and argy-bargy between the states and the Commonwealth, and between all states vying for larger slices of the GST pie. We've all witnessed that GST caper, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. However, it's interesting to note the extent to which the government positions both our reliance upon and our vulnerability to variations in federal grants, as the context framing the fiscal choices the government does have the power and flexibility to make. Primarily, I mean the decision to rely almost exclusively on cutting spending with minimal focus, if any, on investigating additional or alternative revenue sources. This is despite the Treasurer's speech stating, and I quote,